She was found floating in the dark water off Catalina Island. No one saw what happened, no one heard a splash, and for over 40 years the official story was simple: an accident. A woman who had been drinking, who slipped, who fell into the cold Pacific and never came back up. But here's the thing that has never sat right with people. The ones who were there that night, the ones who should have been able to explain exactly what happened, they never quite told the same story. And for a very long time, the people who had the most to say said the least. Natalie Wood was not just a star. She was the kind of performer who made you forget there was a camera in the room. She had grown up on screen, literally, a child pushed into the spotlight before she was old enough to choose it for herself, who somehow grew into a woman of genuine, rare talent. She earned Oscar nominations. She made films that still hold up today. She was beautiful in a way that felt honest, not manufactured. And by the time November 1981 arrived, her life, the real life behind the fame, finally looked like it had found solid ground. She was 43 years old. She was working on a film she believed in. She was with her husband on their yacht off the California coast. Everything on the surface looked fine, and then she was gone. What followed was one of the most quietly mishandled cases in the history of Hollywood. A case that closed before it should have. A case where accounts shifted, where silence stretched on for decades, where a man who was present that night, one of the most recognizable actors in the world, never once gave investigators a full, formal account of what he witnessed. Now, after all this time, new details have begun to surface. Old voices have grown tired of staying quiet, and the story that was supposed to be finished is, in fact, anything but. What really happened to Natalie Wood is slowly coming into focus, and the more clearly you can see it, the more deeply troubling it becomes. To understand what that night took from the world, you have to understand who Natalie Wood actually was, not the version that lived in magazine headlines, but the real woman underneath all of it. She was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko in San Francisco in 1938, the daughter of Russian immigrants. Her mother, Maria, was a woman of relentless, sometimes frightening ambition, the kind of ambition that doesn't really leave room for the child at the center of it. From the time Natalie was barely old enough to speak clearly, Maria was pointing her toward cameras, toward directors, toward opportunity. Not with encouragement, with pressure. The kind that leaves marks you can't always see. And still, Natalie delivered. She had something on screen that couldn't be rehearsed or manufactured. By the age of 8, she had already appeared in multiple films. By her teenage years, she was not just working, she was defining American cinema. Miracle on 34th Street, Rebel Without a Cause. Splendor in the Grass, West Side Story, these were not small, forgettable projects. These were the films people still talk about, and she was at the heart of every single one. But behind all of that, the life was complicated in ways the public rarely saw. She carried a fear, a deep, specific, documented fear of dark water, that had reportedly been planted in her by her mother when she was very young. Maria had told her, in the particular way that certain kinds of mothers deliver certain kinds of damage, that dark water held a terrible fate for her. It sounds almost mythological. But the people closest to Natalie confirmed it over and over across many years. She would not swim alone in the ocean. She was frightened of what she couldn't see beneath the surface. That fear was real and it never left her. On its own, that detail means nothing. But placed against what happened on that boat, in that darkness off that island, it becomes something almost impossible to look at directly. Natalie had first married Robert Wagner in 1957. That marriage ended. Years passed, marked by struggle and change and the particular weight of living your entire life in public view. Then, in 1972, she and Wagner remarried. By 1981, they had built something that looked, at least from the outside, like a real life together. They had daughters. They had a home. They had history, and they had chosen to stay in it. That November, they boarded their yacht, the Splendor, and headed to Catalina Island. With them were Christopher Walken, Natalie's co-star on her current film, and Dennis Davern, the captain of the boat. It was supposed to be a relaxed weekend away from everything. A small celebration, maybe, a pause. It was not that. On the morning of November 29th, Natalie Wood was found floating face down in the ocean, roughly a mile from the boat. She was dressed in a nightgown and a down jacket. She was already gone. The official ruling was accidental drowning. The case was closed. Quickly, quietly, and, as the years would eventually reveal, far too soon, there is something that tends to get lost in cases like this. People rush toward the night of the tragedy, toward the investigation, toward the arguments about what did or didn't happen. But they skip over where the person was before it all collapsed. And with Natalie, that matters enormously. By the late 1970s and into 1981, she had done something that is genuinely hard to do. She had come back. Her first marriage had ended. There had been years of personal difficulty, of emotional turbulence that she rarely discussed publicly, but that people around her were aware of. The exhaustion of growing up on camera, of never quite belonging to yourself, that kind of thing leaves a mark. But she had worked through it. She had found her footing again. The second marriage to Wagner seemed to be something different from the first, more grounded, more considered. People who were around them described a partnership, not just a performance of one. They had daughters together. They had a shared life that felt, by most accounts, genuinely stable. And her work had found its energy again, too. Brainstorm was a serious film with serious intentions, a science fiction story that dealt with real ideas. She was proud of it. People on set have spoken about the way she carried herself during that production, present, engaged, genuinely excited about what she was making. This was not a woman going through the motions of a career she had outgrown. This was someone who had rediscovered what she loved about the work. Friends who were in contact with her in the weeks before that November weekend remember a woman who seemed, in a very real sense, settled. Content. Not performing happiness for the people around her, actually feeling it. And anyone who has known someone who has been through difficult years and come out the other side understands how different those two things look. That is what makes the weight of this so difficult to carry. When someone's life is finally building toward something good. When the hard years are behind them and the ground beneath their feet feels solid for the first time, the loss of that person doesn't just feel like tragedy. It feels like something was interrupted. Something that mattered was stopped before it could finish becoming what it was becoming. And when the story of how that happened keeps shifting, when the accounts don't line up, when the people present can't seem to agree, the tragedy transforms into something darker. Into a question. A question that for over 4 decades has refused to be answered. The weekend began the way these kinds of weekends often do: dinner on the boat, drinks, conversation. But there was tension beneath the surface of it, according to various accounts. Something between Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken. The exact shape of it has been described differently by different people, and no definitive account has been established. What is consistent across multiple retellings is that the evening did not stay calm. Dennis Davern was there for all of it. He was the captain. He saw what happened. And for years, he said almost nothing. When he finally did start talking, really talking, with the kind of detail that had been absent from his earlier accounts, what he described did not sound like a peaceful night that ended in a terrible accident. It sounded like something far harder to explain away. The official version of that night was always thin. According to the initial investigation, Natalie had apparently gotten up at some point during the night, gone outside. Possibly attempted to secure a small dinghy that had been knocking against the side of the boat, and somehow slipped and fell into the water. No foul play was suspected, the case moved quickly, the ruling arrived fast, but the timeline had gaps in it that never fully closed. And the people who were actually present on that boat never quite told the same story. Dennis Davern, in the years after he finally decided to speak more openly, described something very different from a quiet night interrupted by a tragic accident. He described heavy drinking. He described an argument that escalated, a confrontation between Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken that became genuinely heated. That filled the cabin of the boat with the kind of anger that changes the atmosphere of a space. And then he described the moment when they realized Natalie was no longer on the boat, and the time that passed after that moment before anyone called for help. That delay, according to Davern's account, was not brief. And in a situation where a person has gone into cold, dark ocean water in the middle of the night, every minute that passes without a rescue call being made is a minute that cannot be recovered. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department closed the case in 1981. It stayed closed for 30 years. Then, in 2011, it was reopened, not because forensic technology had produced some dramatic new breakthrough, but because Davern had taken his fuller account public. And what he was describing raised enough serious concern that investigators felt they had to look again. What followed was significant, even if it was framed quietly. The official manner of Natalie Wood's death was updated. It was changed from accidental drowning to something that included 3 additional words: other undetermined factors. 3 words that, in the language of official investigations, carry considerable weight. 3 words that represent formal, documented acknowledgement, that not everything about what happened that night was understood. And that acknowledgement, arriving 30 years after the fact, made a question louder that had been circling for a very long time. If this was simply an accident, a sad, straightforward accident on a boat, why did it take 30 years for the full story to begin emerging? Why did the captain of that boat wait decades to say what he saw? And why, across all those years, did Robert Wagner never sit down with investigators and walk through the night in complete detail? Investigations depend on facts, but they are also shaped profoundly by what people choose to say and what they choose to hold back. And in the years that followed Natalie Wood's death, there was a great deal that was held back. Robert Wagner did speak publicly across many years. He gave interviews. He wrote a memoir. He appeared on television and spoke about Natalie with what read, to many observers, as genuine grief. He did not disappear from public life. But when conversations turned to the specific details of that night, the argument, the sequence of events, the hours between when Natalie was last seen and when she was found, the answers he gave tended to stay vague. General, incomplete in ways that left room for more questions rather than fewer. In 2018, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department took a formal step. They named Robert Wagner a person of interest in the case. It is important to be precise about what that means and what it does not mean. It is not the same as being named a suspect. It does not carry any implication of proven guilt. No charges have been filed against Robert Wagner. No official conclusion placing responsibility on any individual has been reached. What it does mean, formally, in the language investigators use, is that they believe he possesses information relevant to the case that has not yet been fully disclosed. Wagner has denied any wrongdoing through his representatives. That denial stands, and the legal record reflects no finding against him. But the designation changed the tone of the conversation in ways that could not be undone. For decades, this had been treated as a tragedy, awful but comprehensible. An accident. Something that happened. The person of interest designation made it impossible to continue holding onto that framing without also holding onto a set of unanswered questions. The response within Natalie's own family has not been unified, and that complexity deserves to be acknowledged. Her daughter, Natasha Gregson Wagner, has stood publicly behind her stepfather. She has spoken about him with love and defended him against what she considers unfair characterization. That is not a small thing. It is the voice of someone who knew these people, who lived within this family and whose grief and loyalty are both real. But Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, has spoken from a very different place. She has said clearly and repeatedly that she does not accept the accident narrative. She has asked for a full, honest accounting of what happened on that boat. She has spent years not quietly, not passively, trying to make sure her sister's case is not simply allowed to fade into the past. Between those two positions, between protecting the living and seeking truth for the lost, there is a tension that has no easy resolution. It runs through this entire case, quietly and constantly, like something just below the surface. Forensic evidence does not carry emotion. It does not care about reputations or legacies or the discomfort that certain findings might create for powerful people. It deals in physical reality, and physical reality, in this case, raised questions that the original investigation did not fully address. When the forensic evidence was re-examined in the years following the case reopening, attention was drawn to bruising found on Natalie's body, on her arms, on her legs that had been documented at the time of the original examination. The explanation offered initially was that these injuries occurred during her struggle in the water, or in the process of her body being recovered. But certain forensic experts, upon reviewing the available evidence more carefully, raised a different possibility. The pattern of some of those bruises, their location, their character, was described, by those experts, as being more consistent with injury that happened before she entered the water. Not as a result of it. According to reports from those who reviewed the findings, some of the bruising appeared to indicate contact that occurred while she was still on the boat. This does not establish any definitive conclusion. Forensic interpretation is not an exact science, and different experts examining the same evidence can reach genuinely different conclusions. No official finding has declared, as a matter of established fact, that Natalie Wood sustained injuries prior to her drowning. What can be said, carefully and accurately, is that questions were raised by the physical evidence, questions that, according to investigators and experts who examined it, the original investigation did not adequately resolve. There is also the matter of what she was wearing when she was found. A down jacket over a nightgown in the middle of the night in cold ocean water. Anyone who has spent time near the sea understands what happens to a waterlogged down jacket. It absorbs water rapidly. It becomes extraordinarily heavy. It pulls downward. For someone already in distress, already struggling to stay above a dark surface, that weight would have been devastating. It would have made survival almost impossible. Why was she wearing a jacket over a nightgown? Where was she going or trying to go? Was she attempting to leave the boat? Was she outside for a reason that had nothing to do with a loose dinghy making noise against the hull? These are not rhetorical questions used to imply a predetermined answer. They are genuine, open questions, the kind that a complete investigation would have been expected to pursue, and that the original investigation, by most accounts, did not. There is a dimension to this case that exists beyond the legal questions, beyond the forensic analysis, beyond the conflicting accounts. It touches something broader. Something about the way certain stories get handled or don't get handled depending on who is involved in them. Natalie Wood died in 1981. In that era, in that industry, the idea of conducting a thorough, uncomfortable investigation into the death of a famous woman when powerful men were present and connected to the circumstances, that was not something that happened easily or often. Investigations were brief. Rulings came quickly. The people with names and lawyers and connections moved on, and the rest of the world was expected to move on with them. That pattern is not unique to this case. It appears in other stories from the same era in the same world. It reflects something true and uncomfortable about who, historically, has been protected by institutions, and who has been left with unanswered questions. The people who have spent years trying to keep Natalie's case from disappearing entirely. Lana Wood, journalists. Investigators who return to the evidence again and again have often been dismissed. Characterized as people who can't accept a simple tragedy, people who need a villain where there is none. But what they have actually been doing all along is refusing to accept an incomplete answer in place of a real one. Dennis Davern has spoken about what it cost him to stay quiet for as long as he did. He has described the weight of it, the way it followed him, the way it changed him. Whatever led him to hold back for so many years, and the reasons appear to involve fear, loyalty, and the particular vulnerability of someone without power who is connected to people who have a great deal of it. What matters is that he eventually chose to say more than he had before. And here is a quiet truth worth sitting with. People do not typically spend decades carrying guilt over accidents. Accidents are painful, they are grieved. But the specific texture of guilt, the kind that doesn't lift, the kind that rewrites a person, is generally reserved for something different, for choices made, for moments of inaction, for things witnessed that were not reported. Whatever Davern witnessed on the splendor that November night, the weight of it appears to have been something he could not set down. His account taken in full describes a night that was far more volatile, far more chaotic, and far more troublingly handled in its aftermath than the original investigation ever came close to acknowledging. Whether that ultimately amounts to something criminal is a question that no official body has yet conclusively answered, but it amounts to something. It has always amounted to something. And it deserved serious, unhurried, honest attention from the very beginning, attention it did not receive. Natalie Wood was afraid of dark water her whole life. Sit with that for a moment. A woman who had carried that specific fear since childhood, who had been told, by the person who was supposed to protect her, that the dark water held something terrible waiting for her, ended her life alone in the ocean, in the dark, unable to be saved. Whatever the full truth of that night turns out to be, that image does not loosen its hold on you easily. It stays. It asks something of you. What this case asks, beyond the legal questions, beyond the investigation, beyond the names and the timelines and the forensic language, is something quieter and harder. It asks us to sit with uncertainty without filling it in carelessly, to resist declaring guilt where no guilt has been officially established, but equally to resist accepting a simple, comfortable answer where the evidence and the accounts and the silences all point toward something more complicated. Natalie Wood was real. She was not just a case file, not just a name that trends every few years when the story surfaces again. She was a woman who had fought for her own peace of mind, who had rebuilt her life after it fell apart, who had daughters who adored her, a sister who has never once stopped fighting for her, and friends who remember her as warm and funny and deeply genuinely human beneath everything the camera ever captured of her. She deserved a thorough investigation from the night she was found. She deserved honesty, not the quick ruling, not the closed file, not the powerful names being quietly protected while questions were left to linger in the dark. More than 40 years have passed. Robert Wagner remains formally designated as a person of interest. No charges have been filed, no one has been held to account. The official cause of death still carries those three words, other undetermined factors, that the original investigation never needed to leave room for, and yet somehow did. Whether the full truth ever surfaces, whether the people who know what happened will one day say it plainly, clearly on record, remains an open question. Some cases eventually break completely open and the truth spills out all at once. Others hold their secrets and the people who carry those secrets carry them to the end. There is no guarantee that this one resolves in the way that Lana Wood and others have spent decades hoping for. But the conversation is no longer buried in the way it once was. The questions are no longer whispered in corners. Natalie Wood is not being forgotten, not by her family, not by the people who have dedicated real time and effort to understanding what happened, and not by the growing number of people who feel, with a quiet but certain conviction, that the version of events they were given was never the complete one. Some stories hold on, some questions refuse to be answered until the time is right, or until the people holding the answers decide they can no longer hold them. This story, after more than 40 years, is still holding on. It is not finished yet. If this stayed with you, if something in it made you pause or think or feel the weight of a life that deserved more than it received, then you already understand why stories like this matter. Truth is worth the discomfort of not having it neatly resolved. It's worth the patience. It's worth the continued attention. If you'd like to see more stories told with this kind of care, consider subscribing and sharing what you think in the comments. What do you believe happened that night? And does it matter to you that, after all this time, we still don't fully know?